Good morning, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Ron Paul is away today giving a speech somewhere, so I will be handling today's show. Thankfully not alone, but with a guest who's an old friend of mine. He's a former U.S. diplomat and former senior advisor to the Republican Senate leadership. Jim Jatras will join me today, and we're going to chew on the headlines. Jim, are you there?
Yes, I'm glad you put the emphasis on old friend. I guess we can bring some seniority to this discussion.
That's right. That's right. A couple of decades, actually. But Jim is great on this topic because he's been on both sides. You know, he's been in the executive branch. He knows how that doesn't work or works. He's been on the legislative side. He knows how that doesn't work. So he's fully functional in all the dysfunction of government. So we're going to kind of do this a little different today because there's a lot in the news. There's a lot to digest. There's a lot to deal with. So we're just going to boom over the three things that I think right now we should be focused on. The first one is Lebanon. Color revolt in Lebanon. Is that what's going on? What is going on there? Lebanon, as well as a lot of other places in the world right now. We're going to focus here, though. A lot of people in the streets, at least a week of protests. They say the buzzword of the protest, corruption. We got to get rid of corruption. Prime Minister Hariri announced that he would tender his resignation in light of the protests. He tried to make concessions earlier, but that only emboldened the protests. That's, I think, point number one to consider. Hezbollah, which is a senior partner in the government, they've got 13 seats in parliament. They have 3 cabinet positions. They are opposed to the protests. They're concerned about the protests. They are not happy about what's happening there. They are a major political force, as I said. The State Department, another factor in this, quote, rightly angered. The protesters are rightly angered by government refusal to tackle corruption. So the U.S. is happy. Jim, what's going on here and who's benefiting from this? What's the real story? What do you see?
Well, look, I think on the one hand, you hear some people saying that the globalist order, the neoliberal order, is breaking down. There are a lot of losers in that, especially younger people, and there's a lot of social unrest due to that. And I don't discount any of that, but I have to admit my spidey sense starts tingling when you get this kind of a Marxist narrative of the suffering masses have finally reached the limits of their misery, and as one, they're rising up in righteous anger against their oppressors, and cheered on by the media, but very, very selectively. For example, Hong Kong good, but yellow vests bad. I don't know. I guess I just have to be a little bit suspicious about the way the media in elite opinion collectively choose for some movements which are fully justified in their grievances, and others who are just a bunch of racist deplorables or something. I guess I look for Bernard Henri Lévy to tell us who are the good ones and who are the bad ones, and we can
Yeah, you know, I have a new tool, Jim, when I start thinking about this. I use Google. I use it in a way Google doesn't intend you to use it. So I Googled earlier, Lebanon protests, U.S. government involvement or something like this. Page after page, Washington Post, New York Times, da-da-da-da-da, wonderful, fantastic. And then I said, okay, I'm going to go to DuckDuckGo and do the same thing. Page 1, there's an article right up front about the U.S. government response to it, which I think tells a lot. So It's interesting how these things are increasingly managed by your search engine. But here's the U.S. government. Here's an unnamed U.S. government official. Thank you, DuckDuckGo, for pointing this out, because I wouldn't have found it on Google. Quote, the United States government supports the people of Lebanon, their call for action for reform, for fighting corruption. Young people, it seems to be they're involved a lot. Okay, that sets up some flags. And
Sure.
Some of their slogans. Where does our tax money go? Where does our tax money go? Not to say that there's no basis for this, but I'm seeing some things, some patterns here, Jim. Does it smell a little like Ukraine, a little like Hong Kong, a little like the others that we've seen?
Well, exactly. And you notice you get a lot of comparisons to the Arab Spring, and we know how that turned out, that the Arab Spring turned into the Salafist winter.
Yeah.
You're not seeing a whole lot of comparisons to the color revolutions, that took place in the former Soviet bloc, basically, over the last couple of decades. And again, I'm very suspicious when you have this anointing of the popular will by people whose judgment of their fellow citizens I find anything but trustworthy, as we saw, for example, in Ukraine and Georgia and places like that, when you have a fraction of 1% of the people, mostly urban people, turning out on the street, and suddenly they're anointed as the will of the nation, as though the other 99% plus necessarily sympathize with this. I don't know. We also see the disparity, for example, between the coverage of the pro-Catalan separatist protesters in Spain versus the unionist, anti-separatist protesters, who are depicted in completely different light, or sometimes simply ignored because they don't fit into whatever the narrative is. I would agree with you, Daniel. I don't discount what the immediate complaints people may have, whether it's in Lebanon with the price of cellular service and WhatsApp and all that, or in Chile with public transportation. But it's just in the normal sense of things, the way people behave. Just because a price of something has gone up or the trash doesn't get collected, ordinary people don't simply run out in the streets and start burning buses. Something has to spark it. Something has to lead people to think it's okay to do this. The other thing, by the way, is what is the reaction to the authorities? I saw there was something in one of the authoritative Chinese papers saying some of this may have been sparked by the fact that the police haven't responded with a particularly heavy hand in Hong Kong, and that then may inspire people in other countries to say, yeah, we can go ahead and do this, and they're not going to blast our eye out or smash off our hand like has happened to people in France.
Yeah, indeed, and we know we've seen the checks being cashed in Hong Kong. We know the U.S. is funding the salaries of the Venezuelan opposition, so we know with the hands where they are. You raise a good question, though, Jim. Who are the people? All of this is done in the name of democracy, this wonderful democracy.
Yeah.
You go vote, you choose your government. It's all wonderful, and if you don't go vote, we're going to bomb you and make you vote. Well, who are the people? Does 1% of the people showing up saying, hey, WhatsApp is too expensive, does that mean you get to overthrow the government? And we consider ourselves to be pretty sophisticated politically here in the U.S. Why don't we ever protest when this stuff happens? Why don't we protest against our own corruption? The Pentagon loses a few $1 trillion and people just yawn. So, what is all that about? In Libya, I just saw a picture and a little caption. Back in 2011, the largest public political protest in history. Virtually the entire Libyan capital turned out to protest against the sanctions and the coming attacks on the Libyan government. A big yawn. Those really aren't the people. Same thing is true with Maduro. Hundreds of thousands of people out, no coverage. You mentioned the yellow vest. The same thing. So who gets to decide who are the people? Here's another factor, Jim, in the Lebanon thing that's interesting. International donors have promised $11 billion to Lebanon, but only if economic reforms happen. So here's something like another piece of this puzzle that we see elsewhere. Did you notice that?
Yes, it is. Again, one of the paradoxes, we're told that these are people who are concerned about corruption, about social disparity and wealth disparity and so forth. And what is the solution to that? Is more globalization, more involvement of the international banks and so forth. Why do I have the feeling that the medicine is going to be more of the poison that's created part of the problems in the first place? And that it is selectively used by the big international structures to simply further their control over what had been sovereign countries.
Yeah, we have to ask ourselves a question: who benefits? Who benefits from Hezbollah being wrong-footed in Lebanon? There can't be any question. It's Israel, it's Saudi Arabia, it's the U.S. We wanted to break up Lebanon for a long time. I can't see, if you ask, cui bono, you can't not answer it that way. But let's move on to Syria, because back to Syria, the Pentagon confirmed a column of U.S. forces has crossed from Iraq back to Syria. These guys are putting a lot of mileage on those personnel carriers. They got out of Syria back to Iraq. Now they're going back in. They're going toward Deir ez-Zor. They are preventing the oil from being controlled by ISIS. but our Secretary of Defense let the cat out of the bag in an interview today or yesterday, where he said he wants to hand those oil fields over to the SDF, which are our proxy forces, the Kurds, the Syrian branch of the PKK, essentially, to use that to fund their organization. They're trying to dangle a carrot again in front of the SDF of the Kurds after them being, quote, betrayed by the U.S. Will the Kurds go for it? Will they use it? And by what measure does Esper have the right to give Syrian oil to the Kurds?
You know, I think they should suggest to the Kurds that they change their logo from the red star on the gold field into Charlie Brown kicking the football, because once again, the Americans are going to promise to give them whatever it is they say they want. And at some point, we're going to turn around and say, yeah, on second thought, no. I think if the Kurds fall for this, they're foolish. I mean, that it seemed quite clear after President Trump announced that we would be getting out, and of course, I took that with a grain of salt, that they were pretty quick in contacting the folks in Damascus and doing what they should have done years ago, that certainly the Russians were advising them, and even some people quietly in the U.S. military were advising them, you better patch things up with Damascus, because eventually we're going to be gone. And that's really going to be your only protection, is to reintegrate back into Syrian society. And it seems that those who are trying to throw sand into the gears of what the president really wants, which is to get out of there, and we'll have to see if he delivers. I'm still somewhat skeptical that's going to happen, is that they're using the oil as a pot of honey to say, well, maybe we can stay here because we're going to keep that oil out of ISIS hands, but really use it to fund an autonomous entity up here with the Kurds to keep them fully going back from under Damascus umbrella. And more importantly, even if this war starts to draw to a close, we do not want Syria's oil going back to the people of Syria to help rebuild the country that we and our allies have helped to destroy for the last 8 years.
Excuse my crudeness, but the same morons who designed the 2011 Assad must go policy are still in the driver's seat. This seems like a new chapter in the Assad must go phenomenon, and it'll probably end up the same. But we know that as far as I understand, the area around Deir ez-Zor is not a Kurdish area traditionally. So the idea that we're going to encourage them to go there and colonize the area, it's not going to sit well with the locals, I don't think. We know that Bolton told the Kurds, don't you dare talk to Assad, don't you dare talk to the Syrian government. And they didn't. And as soon as we pulled out, they ran to Damascus, they ran to make a deal, they made a decent deal from their perspective to save their hides. And that's when all of a sudden you see this great idea. Dr. Paul wrote about it this week. Trump sat down to have lunch with Lindsey Graham. That must have been a lot of fun. And he got up from the lunch and decided, let's take the oil. But here's something, Jim, I wanted to get your view on. Here's our Secretary of Defense, once again, Esper. And he warned that the U.S. will use, quote, overwhelming force against any force challenging the U.S. occupation of Syrian oil fields. A journalist asked him, does that include Russian or Syrian forces? He said, one word answer, yes. What the heck is going on? Esper wants to start a world war with Russia over a couple of basically pretty third-rate oil wells? What does this mean?
Unfortunately, Daniel, as we've discussed many times in the past, nobody quite has the answer as to why does President Trump completely surround himself with people who, A, don't like him, and B, don't share his views on anything, and then wonder why he can't get anything done. That he said, how many times I want to get out of Syria, I want to get out of Afghanistan, but it never, ever ends up happening because his minions have their own little plots and plans where they can keep our thumb in the pie. And even if Assad must go is no longer an operative or realistic possibility, we still want to have some leverage in Syria over the final settlement, make sure the Russians and the Iranians don't move in, and then use ISIS as an excuse. Although if you wanted the quickest and most, let's say, definitive way to make sure ISIS isn't coming back, let the Syrians and the Russians and the Iranians take care of it, because I think they will kill them very much.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's sad about this is, aside from the lying spin you get from our media about what's really going on here, I don't think most Americans really know very much about these places, who these people are. Don't ask the obvious question. Like, for example, all this brouhaha about killing al-Baghdadi for what is this, the eighth time? So let's assume that his cat's 9 lives have really run out now. Nobody mentions he was killed in Idlib, which is Al Qaeda's stronghold, not an ISIS stronghold. Supposedly Al Qaeda are their enemies. What's going on here? Who was really protecting him up there? Who supplied the information that finally led to his being targeted? There's a lot of questions like that you're never going to hear asked, much less answered, on our media.
Well, the story we get is is typical salacious when someone stole his skivvies, and that's how they found out he was there. So how'd you like that job? But yeah, exactly. And no one knows. The media is not saying he was found in an area he really kind of shouldn't have been. It doesn't make any sense if they're mortal enemies. But you hear that always the bumper stickers. If we leave, there will be a vacuum. That we have to stay there as a force for stability and stabilization. Whereas in fact, this destabilization.
It's quite the opposite. There's not a vacuum. It's more of a dog in the manger situation. As long as we stay there, and the Russians, the Syrians, the Iranians, despite the dire threats from Esper, I don't think that's really the issue. They don't want to fight with us. Not necessarily, I think, because they're afraid we're going to come down like a ton of bricks, although we might. Maybe these people are willing to risk a war over those, like you say, third-rate oil fields that don't really mean anything except to the people of Syria. But I think they're trying to find some way to bring this war to a close, and the people running Mr. Trump's administration for him are trying to find some way to keep that little pot stirring just to make sure we're still in the game and make sure people still keep dying, so we have some leverage over a final settlement, and that we this Shiite land bridge or whatever this nonsense is doesn't come to being.
Well, it's all about
jobs. By the way, Daniel, I wouldn't exclude that what we're seeing in Lebanon is in part a spin-off from that. That if things in Syria are not going the way these people want them to, well, maybe we can open a new front over here in Lebanon.
Yeah, light a forest fire. That sounds like the modus operandi. Well, we need to switch gears for our final topic, and this is impeachment. Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Lindman. Now the surprise witness. He is a Ukrainian-born American citizen who went into the military. He is the NSC's Ukraine hand, an ally of Bolton, an employee of Fiona Hill, and I'm sure you know a lot about her. He is going to be called before the House impeachment effort to tell of his view. He was very upset about Trump's phone call to Zelensky. And it would be a bomb, except the fact that we know what the call said. We have the transcript. But here's what he said. I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen. That's the first thing. Okay, well, we've read the transcript, and that's not what he said. That was 300 or so words down, and it was a suggestion, not a demand. So already there's a mischaracterization in what he's proffering for his testimony. And here's the second part, Jim, and I'm going to ask you a question on this, because you asked me the question in an email, so I'm going to ask it back to you. And here's what Lindman said. I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine. So where is the line? And you asked this, and I'll ask it to you. Where is the line between someone like Lindman working for the people and the government of the United States and working for the people of Ukraine?
And I think the short answer is nobody knows. I mean, there's even been a report that the whistleblower may not have been on the U.S. side of the call at all, or in fact wasn't on the call at all, but may have been somebody on the Ukrainian side that was working with the CIA. We simply do not know, and it seems that unfortunately that this relationship has gotten so cozy between, if you will, the much overworked term, the deep state on our side and the deep state on their side. It's really hard to tell where one leaves off and the other one begins. And of course, again, the media focus here, the Democrats' focus has all been getting the Ukrainians to investigate a political opponent, when of course the real focus was what happened in 2016. Yeah. What was the Ukrainian role in starting the whole Russiagate ball going with the Steele dossier and this Chalupa woman, this Democratic activist, and the other words, CrowdStrike and all the rest of it. What happened in 2016 to start what was clearly an anti-constitutional plot within these agencies, both U.S. and foreign, including not Ukraine, but obviously the United Kingdom and several others. that's what supposedly Mr. Durham and Mr. Barr are getting to the bottom of. I'm not. I'm rather skeptical that they will actually do so. And that's really what the underlying story here is. And now, being the masochist that I am and watching MSNBC this morning, that what they're now doing is saying, aha, the smoking gun from this lieutenant colonel is that Trump was undermining our national security by not giving weapons to this frontline state that's holding off Russian aggression. He was actually subverting the American national security for his political gain. I think that's the real bait with which they're going to go after Republicans in the Senate to say, you really need to vote to get rid of this guy.
Yeah, and by what rights did they tell the president? Certainly there's advice and consent, there's oversight in Congress, but the president does have a constitutional authority to determine U.S. foreign policy, with some qualifications.
Oh no, Dan, you got that wrong. It says right in the Constitution, the executive power of the United States is vested in an intelligence community.
Yeah,
it says there. It says right there.
Unless you elect Trump, but unfortunately, blockhead America, and a lot of them are watching the mainstream media. They will listen to what you said, and their eyes will glaze over and say, "Well, but I hate Trump, so who cares?" And a lot of people don't like Trump. I've not been a supporter of the president's, but this goes beyond that, it seems to me, that if you can do this, then what's going to happen, Democrats? It's going to come back to haunt you. You see a lot of misdirection and projection in these
claims. And that's something that the Republicans keep saying, that, if this happens to this president, it'll come back and bite the Democrats someday. Frankly, I don't think that will happen. Because if this were successful, let's remember that the media are a necessary component of what is really a coup attempt here, and they will always be on that side of the spectrum. So a Democratic president would not have to worry about this.
Yeah, and what happens to the rest of us who challenge these things? We're kicked off of the social media, so we don't have any chance to even raise the issue. Here's another thing on Lindman before we get away from this, and I think it's important. This is from a piece, I think it's a quote, but it's a piece that I saw in Zero Hedge. He, quote, regularly advised the Ukrainian government on how to deal with Trump's lawyer, Giuliani. And that goes back to the previous question. What is this guy doing in the National Security Council staff where you're advising a foreign government on how to manipulate and how to deal with the government that actually is paying your salary? This is really, you say overused term deep state, absolutely right. But this is not the epitome of the deep state. I don't know what is.
Well, and unfortunately, that's not the only example. It wasn't well reported. Recall that Kurt Volker, the former special envoy there, was working in a U.S. government capacity gratis, while, according to the reports, he was still being paid by the McCain Institute, which was in part funded by BGR, his lobbying firm, among whose clients were Petro Poroshenko and Raytheon, the maker of the Javelin missiles he was trying to provide to Ukraine. Now, as far as I know, none of that is technically illegal, but it does create an appearance problem. Who is really, which side is your bread really buttered on? Is it on the side of the U.S. government and the American people, which aren't necessarily the same thing nowadays, it seems, or is it the Ukrainian government or a private arms manufacturer? Who knows?
Yeah, it goes back to corruption. At least the Lebanese are a little bit concerned about it. Americans just seem to be,
Well, to see that, and that's the thing, Daniel. In a lot of countries, when you say corruption, it's petty corruption. It's the cops shaking you down for a bribe when you get stopped at a red light or something like that. Whereas here, the corruption is all out in the open, above board. Our elites, feather their nests through the public wheel any number of different ways. And as they say, it's all honest graft. It's all by the book, and nobody can really fault them for it. That kind of corruption, which is much, much bigger, macro corruption, is much more subversive of the social order and of any sense of the rule of law and common decency compared to some cop asking for a bribe.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole Lindman thing reminds me of some of my experiences on the Hill. There was a guy there who controlled, to a degree, he was a permanent employee of Congress. He was Ukrainian by birth, if I remember correctly. But he controlled the policy. And I remember during the Magnitsky thing, and Dr. Paul, as you know, was very strongly opposed to this. But this guy basically managed the entire thing behind the scenes. He pulled the strings. And I remember when we put in a bill to get rid of sanctions on Belarus, he called me up and was flipping out over the whole, how dare you, what are you doing, this and that. So you have these kinds of people with kind of a strange feeling of loyalty to the ancestral homeland who get in there and really do the bidding of that homeland. And it really is a danger, and it's a touchy subject because there's a lot of people in D.C. that do that. But it really is, you do have to wonder, hey, if you come over here, you got to leave those things behind. But they can carve out these niches where they can get an enormous amount of power. Nobody's ever heard of them. But look what happened with Magnitsky.
And the flip side of that is unfortunately, I think that regular old non-ethnic Americans, and I'm basically an ethnic American, I hope my loyalty is more to just America itself, but non-American ethnic Americans have been so cowed and so, let's say, bled white out of their own sense of identity. They really, it's amazing how unaware of this that they are. They are unaware of all the special pleading that goes through all these various foreign influences. And if they did stop to think, well, what about putting America first? Well, then that means they're racist, anti-Semitic, Islamic phobic, whatever else, any other phobic you can think of, because Americans are not supposed to have an ethnic identity. We're not supposed to think of our own country.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Well, Jim, we've run out of time. We probably could go a lot longer, but we have a big bite that we chewed off. We're trying to chew on it and swallow it. Hopefully our viewers will be able to digest it a little bit with us breaking it down. I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us. It's always great talking to you on air or off air. And I really want to thank our viewers for joining us today and every day. You make the show possible by viewing. Please subscribe if you've just happened upon this or if you watch it casually. Please subscribe to the channel. Go to ronpaulinstitute.org and subscribe for our updates there. They're all free. We never share your name. So be part of this important community and keep in touch, because we have to see through the lies that are being told to us. So thanks very much. See you next time on the Ron Paul Liberty Report.